Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a state governed by fear. Under his command, politics became repression, and loyalty became the only way to survive. The machinery of power left no room for doubt or dissent. The party, the institutions, and the society were forcibly molded. Absolute control eliminated rivals, silenced voices, and made obedience the norm. Every step was watched, every word could turn into a condemnation. The system operated not with trust, but with terror. How did one man manage to concentrate so much power without real opposition? What made it possible for obedience to replace debate and for fear to build walls stronger than any border? What legacy did a government leave that turned discipline into its most lethal weapon? In April of 1922, the Soviet Union was trying to consolidate itself after the devastation of the Civil War. In that context, Joseph Djugashvili received a position that seemed secondary: General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Officially, his functions were administrative, focused on coordinating appointments and maintaining the bureaucratic machinery. For more prestigious figures like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, that post seemed irrelevant compared to the strategic discussions taking place in the Politburo. However, Stalin understood that this apparent weakness was an opportunity. From the General Secretariat, he began to weave a network of loyalties within the local and regional committees. Through the Worker and Peasant Inspection and the Control Commission, also under his command, he placed officials who depended directly on him to maintain his position. Each transfer and each promotion reinforced an invisible framework that, in a few years, provided him with a decisive political advantage. In those same years, Vladimir Lenin was suffering the effects of several strokes that kept him away from the effective leadership of the party. Between December of 1922 and January of 1923, he dictated what would later be known as his political testament. There he pointed out the weaknesses of the main Bolshevik leaders, but his warnings about Stalin were particularly harsh. He described him as crude and dangerous in the exercise of power and suggested his replacement in the General Secretariat. Even so, after Lenin's death on the 21st of January of 1924, that document was carefully contained. Stalin, allied at that time with Zinoviev and Kamenev, managed to prevent its public dissemination by arguing that the founder of the Soviet state had not written those notes in a state of full lucidity. In this way, the warning was diluted in the inner circles. Leon Trotsky, with his military and revolutionary prestige, represented the main obstacle to Stalin's consolidation. He had been the organizer of the Red Army during the Civil War and enjoyed incomparable moral authority, but he lacked a solid party structure. His oratory interventions and theoretical writings contrasted with Stalin's patient action, securing positions in regional secretariats, youth organizations, and grassroots committees. The difference in power building soon proved decisive. In 1923, Trotsky denounced the growing bureaucratization of the party. This criticism was presented by Stalin and his allies as a violation of the internal discipline established in the 10th Congress. They accused him of factionalism, that is, dividing the party at a time when national reconstruction demanded cohesion. The result was his political isolation. 2 years later, he lost his position as War Commissioner, and in 1927 he was expelled from the Central Committee, and later from the party. By 1929 he had been deported out of the Soviet Union, leaving Stalin without his most prestigious rival. The end of Trotsky did not mean the end of the maneuvers. The initial alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev fractured, and Stalin sought new support among leaders like Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky. These defended a more moderate economic line, tolerant of the peasantry, and favorable to gradual development. With their support, Stalin promoted the thesis of socialism in one single country, which contrasted with the Trotskyist strategy of permanent revolution. Presenting himself as a defender of internal stability against international adventures gave him a margin of credibility with broad sectors of the party. The truce with the moderates lasted little. By 1928, The grain supply crisis and tensions with the peasantry offered a new scenario. Stalin accused Bukharin and his allies of favoring the kulaks, the wealthy peasants, and of hindering industrialization. The dispute led to the loss of influence of Bukharin, who stopped controlling Pravda and was sidelined from the decision-making bodies. In a few years, the various alliances that Stalin had woven disintegrated one after another, but each rupture ended up consolidating his dominance even more. Power was not asserted only in the political arena. In parallel, Stalin promoted a cult of his figure. Official biographies began to magnify his role in the October Revolution and in the Civil War, while the press presented him as the direct heir of Lenin. His interventions frequently appeared in the newspapers, and at party congresses his name was cited as a guarantor of revolutionary continuity. The construction of that image was not only propaganda, it reinforced the perception of inevitability around his leadership. The repressive apparatus played an increasing role in this process. The OGPU, heir to the Cheka, was used to monitor suspected leaders and produce files that could be used to justify expulsions or internal exiles. Some opponents were sent to Siberia or other remote regions, while others were selectively eliminated. The interception of correspondence became a common resource for documenting critical opinions and using them as a tool of pressure. In this way, repression acquired a very precise political function. It not only punished, it also disciplined. Bureaucratic manipulation was another of the key mechanisms. Stalin controlled the agendas of the Politburo meetings, decided which topics were discussed and in what order, and influenced the drafting of resolutions. His privileged access to internal documents allowed him to anticipate positions and prepare counterattacks. With those advantages, he neutralized his rivals before they could organize an effective resistance. Little by little, democratic centralism transformed into a system where discipline weighed more than debate. The grassroots organizations of the party also reflected that concentration of power. The regional secretaries, appointed from Moscow, replicated control practices that subordinated local political life to the line set by the center. Party congresses became ceremonies of adhesion, where decisions already made by a small group were ratified. Open deliberation, characteristic of the early years, was replaced by carefully orchestrated rituals. At the end of the decade, the party had changed its nature. What had been born as an instrument of debate and revolutionary action became a hierarchical structure, controlled from the top and reinforced by an increasingly sophisticated repressive apparatus. Internal purges were no longer justified as personal disputes, but as the defense of socialism against internal enemies. The discourse legitimized expulsions and marginalizations as necessary acts to preserve unity. The foundations of the Stalinist regime were thus established. The absolute control of appointments, the use of the repressive apparatus, the manipulation of internal information, and the construction of a personality cult created a political system distinct from that imagined by Lenin. The Soviet state retained its external form, but its content had changed profoundly. The stage was set for policies that, in the following decade, would reach a total dimension, supported by a machinery that had already demonstrated its effectiveness in eliminating internal resistance. In 1929, once his control over the party was consolidated, Stalin embarked on a transformation that irreversibly altered life in the Soviet countryside. The official policy mandated grouping the lands into collective farms, known as kolkhozes, and state farms, the sovkhozes. The justification was to industrialize the country quickly, using grain exports as the main source of foreign exchange. The speeches presented this measure as the definitive elimination of rural capitalist structures, but in practice it meant a large-scale coercive process. The first step was the so-called dekulakization. From the beginning of 1930, brigades of the party and the OGPU classified millions of peasants as class enemies. Possessing a small piece of machinery, a pair of additional animals, or expressing opposition to requisitions was enough to be considered a kulak. The result was the massive confiscation of properties and the stripping of basic production tools. Hundreds of thousands of families were deported to remote regions of Siberia, Central Asia, or Arctic zones. The transfers were carried out in freight cars without heating or ventilation, with scarce food and water. The journeys lasted weeks, and the mortality rate during the journey was high, especially among the elderly, the sick, and children. Their bodies were often removed at intermediate stations or thrown alongside the tracks. The peasants who remained in their villages faced the direct confiscation of animals and grain. Faced with the prospect of losing everything, many chose to slaughter their cattle and horses to prevent them from falling into the hands of the state. Between 1928 and 1933, the number of cattle was reduced to almost half, which led to a dramatic drop in meat and milk production, as well as in the availability of animal traction power for cultivation. Agriculture was weakened in its material base before the new collective farms could be organized. The government maintained mandatory delivery quotas that exceeded the actual production capacity. Requisition brigades, sometimes accompanied by units of the Red Army, traveled through villages in search of hidden reserves. Inspections included the digging up of yards, the opening of barns, and the checking of wooden floors. Those caught hiding food faced immediate arrests, deportations, or physical punishment. In August of 1932, the so-called Law of the 5 Years was enacted, which punished with long sentences in labor camps and even with the death penalty those who collected small amounts of grain in the collective fields. In the first months after its approval, tens of thousands of sentences were handed down. The consequences were devastating. Between 1932 and 1933, a famine of great magnitude occurred. In Ukraine, demographic estimates place the number of victims between several million and nationwide a total, estimate of between 6 and 8 million deaths. Official reports sent to Moscow described entire villages without food, unburied bodies, and massive child mortality. Despite this information, requisition quotas remained unchanged, and exports continued to support industrialization plans. Ukraine was subjected to additional measures. The movement of hungry peasants to other regions was prohibited, and security cordons were established to prevent their arrival in the cities. Simultaneously, special requisition operations were carried out on the grounds that the Ukrainian population systematically hid grain. The repression also reached local leaders who proposed relief measures. Several regional party officials were dismissed and replaced by officials loyal to Moscow. At the same time, cultural campaigns against the use of the Ukrainian language in educational and administrative institutions intensified. The official propaganda presented a radically different picture. The newspapers published inflated harvest figures and carefully prepared photographs of model farms. In 1933, the visit of the French politician Édouard Herriot was used as a cover-up operation. He was taken through previously supplied villages, and the most affected areas were hidden. Upon his return, he declared that he had not observed any signs of hunger, and these statements were diplomatically exploited to discredit the reports circulating abroad. Meanwhile, the repression reached intellectuals, activists, and peasants accused of sabotage. The deportations resulting from decolectivization exceeded 1.5 million people between 1930 and 1932. The survivors were resettled in inhospitable regions where they had to build settlements from scratch. Many of them later became part of the workforce of the expanding camp system. The repression adopted increasingly sophisticated forms. Specialized brigades used metal probes to detect buried grains, trained dogs located hidden deposits, and rewards were offered to those who denounced their neighbors. Children and teenagers were interrogated about their families' practices, creating a climate of widespread fear and distrust. The peasant resistance, although fragmented, existed in multiple forms. Fires of collective facilities were reported, deliberate destruction of machinery, and attacks on local officials. Some attempts to defend community reserves were thwarted through mass arrests and deportations of entire villages. Official repression responded with exemplary executions and public trials that sought to discourage new opposition actions. The demographic impact was profound. Whole regions lost a substantial percentage of their rural population, in some cases close to half. Numerous towns disappeared completely, and the birth rate decreased sharply for years. Records reveal that the consequences were not limited to direct deaths, but also included the dispersion of families and the lasting reduction of population growth. By the end of 1934, more than 90% of arable land was under the control of collective or state farms. Peasant resistance had been neutralized at an enormous human and economic cost. The resulting system turned peasants into workers subject to production plans imposed from Moscow, with priority placed on meeting quotas rather than supplying local communities. Internal reports sent to the central government reported the economic collapse of entire regions, but official directives were not modified. Collectivization continued as an integral part of the industrialization strategy, despite the visible consequences for the population. Famine and violence did not mean the abandonment of this policy, but rather its consolidation through more rigid methods. The peasants were no longer owners of the land, but cogs in a productive system controlled from above. In those years, Soviet agriculture ceased to be a community activity, to become an instrument subordinated to the state's plans for accelerated transformation. The price was a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions and the creation of an agrarian model that would mark the country's development in the following years. On the 1st of December 1934, Sergei Kirov was assassinated at the Smolny headquarters in Leningrad. Leader of the party in that city and member of the Politburo, his death had an immediate impact on the Soviet structure. The perpetrator, Leonid Nikolaev, was arrested on the spot, but the circumstances of the crime were never fully clarified. The official version presented it as a personal act, although from the beginning suspicions arose about a political background. Kirov had acquired growing prestige within the party and enjoyed a popularity that was reflected in the 17th Congress, held months before, where he received an ovation that some considered more intense than that dedicated to Stalin. His independence from certain extreme collectivization measures positioned him as a figure with the potential to challenge influence in the Soviet leadership. The assassination paved the way for a new stage of systematic repression. That same day, the government approved a law that simplified judicial procedures in cases of terrorism. The defendants would be tried without the right to adequate defense, and death sentences would be executed immediately after being pronounced. This legislation laid the legal foundations for what would transform into a massive repression. In the following weeks, thousands of people were arrested. The NKVD, under the direction of Genrikh Yagoda, received orders to investigate supposed conspiracies, and the Kirov case became a pretext to link former opponents with fabricated espionage and sabotage plots. The methods employed to obtain confessions were meticulous. Physical torture included prolonged beatings and techniques designed not to leave visible marks. To this was added sleep deprivation, isolation in freezing cells, and threats directed against close family members. Interrogations could last for weeks until the accused accepted implausible charges, such as international conspiracies or planned attacks against the Soviet leadership. The objective was not to clarify facts, but to produce confessions that publicly validated the official narrative. Between 1936 and 1938, the most emblematic trials took place. In August of 1936, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev faced accusations of conspiring alongside Trotsky to assassinate Stalin. During the trial, they confessed to non-existent crimes and were executed immediately. In January of 1937, 17 officials were tried on similar charges. Karl Radek admitted to collaborating with foreign agents, and Grigory Pyatakov acknowledged conspiracies related to heavy industry. In both cases, the confessions were obtained under coercion, and the accused were sentenced to death or sent to labor camps. The most significant trial occurred in March of 1938, when Nikolai Bukharin and Alexei Rykov were tried along with 18 other leaders. Bukharin, recognized as one of the main theorists of the party, was accused of leading a clandestine organization that sought to restore capitalism. The confessions obtained under pressure sealed their fate and that of their companions, who were executed after the verdict. The Red Army was subjected to an unprecedented purge. In June of 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and other high-ranking officers were arrested, accused of conspiring with Germany to organize a military coup. The trial was held in secret and concluded in a matter of hours with the execution of the accused. In the following months, 3 of the 5 marshals of the country were executed, along with the majority of the army commanders and a large part of the general staff officers. This purge drastically reduced the operational capacity of the Red Army on the eve of the approaching war. In 1936, Nikolai Yezhov replaced Yagoda at the head of the NKVD. During his tenure, known as Yezhovshchina, the repression reached its highest point. Between 1937 and 1938, daily executions were counted by the thousands. Arrest orders were issued in lists with thousands of names, and the sentences were approved directly by Stalin and his close circle. Each region received specific quotas of people to detain, judge, and execute. Local officials competed to exceed those numbers as proof of loyalty. When the usual suspects ran out, citizens were randomly arrested to meet the established numbers. The repression also affected the families of the accused. The wives were automatically arrested as accomplices, while children older than 15 years could be sent to labor camps. Younger children were interned in state-controlled orphanages, which introduced the practice of hereditary guilt. In this way, the punishment transcended the individual and extended to their family environment. The execution methods were systematized in spaces designed for that purpose. In the basement of the Lubyanka, headquarters of the NKVD in Moscow, there was an execution room adapted with drainage systems to facilitate cleaning. The condemned were executed with a shot to the back of the neck, and their bodies were transported in closed trucks to mass graves on the outskirts of the city. The bureaucratic routine of this procedure turned death into just another administrative act of the state. The documented figures reveal the magnitude of the process. Between 1937 and 1938, around 1.5 million people were arrested. Of them, about 700,000 were executed, and more than 1 million sent to the labor camp system. No social sector was left out. Peasants, workers, technicians, scientists, writers, officials, and military personnel were affected by the arrests. The social climate reflected the extent of the terror. Arrests were routinely made during the early morning hours, between 2 and 5. NKVD teams burst into homes, searched belongings, and moved the accused without giving explanations. Many families were unaware for months of the whereabouts of the detainees. Reports multiplied among neighbors, colleagues, and even family members, fueled by fear or the search for political favors. Parents feared their children would repeat at school a comment heard at home. Silence and self-censorship became everyday norms. The manipulation of memory was also part of this process. Official photographers were instructed to remove executed leaders from images. Congresses, meetings, and parades were retouched, erasing entire figures to produce a visual record in line with the official version. This practice transformed photographs into instruments of political control as much as court records. At the end of 1938, Yezhov was dismissed and subsequently executed. Lavrentiy Beria replaced him as the head of the NKVD, reducing the pace of mass executions, although the repression did not cease. The reorganization was more driven by administrative reasons than a questioning of the methods. The state had demonstrated that it could systematically eliminate its opponents and manipulate the political, military, and cultural reality of the country. The period known as the Great Terror completely transformed Soviet life. The party leadership, the army, and the intelligentsia were subjected to an unprecedented purge. The state apparatus perfected legal, police, and propaganda methods to exercise total control. The result was a society marked by fear, distrust, and compulsive obedience, conditions that would durably mark politics and daily life in the Soviet Union. The first labor camps emerged in the years following the October Revolution. Under Lenin, There already were facilities for political prisoners and common criminals, but they were limited in number and scope. It was in the 1930s when the system took on an organized form through the main directorate of camps, known as Gulag, which centralized the administration of these institutions. Since then, the camps became an essential tool of political control, economic exploitation, and colonization of vast regions of Soviet territory. The expansion of the Gulag was concentrated in the most inhospitable areas of the country. Kolyma, in the Far East, became famous for its gold mines and extreme climate, where winters could drop to temperatures impossible to withstand without adequate protection. Vorkuta, located in the Arctic Circle, housed coal mines in lethal conditions. Magadan functioned as a coordination center in northeastern Siberia, from where transport routes and the dispatch of prisoners were managed. The geography of the Gulag reflected the logic of placing prisoners in desolate regions, where resource exploitation coincided with the practical impossibility of escape. One of the most representative principles of the system was designed by Naftali Frenkel, a former prisoner turned administrator. He established a mechanism of rations tied to productivity. Prisoners who met work quotas received slightly more abundant food, while those who fell short suffered reductions. In an environment of permanent hunger, this meant that poor performance accelerated physical weakening and often led to death. Discipline was based on a closed circle, work more to get something more to eat, and failing meant being pushed towards physical collapse. The prison population was heterogeneous. A significant part was composed of political opponents, Mensheviks, Trotskyists, anarchists, or simple citizens accused of anti-Soviet activities. Added to them were deported national minorities such as Poles, Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and Balts. The clergy of different denominations was systematically persecuted, and alongside them were intellectuals, writers, and scientists who had expressed opinions contrary to the regime. Coexistence with common criminals, known as urki, created constant tensions. The latter enjoyed a certain tacit support from the authorities, who used them to control political prisoners through daily violence. Forced labor constituted the basis of the system. The prisoners participated in landmark projects like the White Sea Canal, built between 1931 and 1933, where tens of thousands of workers died. Despite the human losses, the project proved to be of little practical use, as its dimensions were insufficient for the navigation of large draft ships. In Kolyma, prisoners worked in gold mines with rudimentary tools, enduring endless days under extreme temperatures. Labor, exploitation, more than being oriented towards economic efficiency, responded to the logic of obtaining immediate benefits at the expense of the lives of the prisoners. The living conditions were deliberately harsh. The diet was based on low-quality bread, watery soups, and small portions of cereals. Malnutrition led to illnesses such as scurvy, dysentery, and tuberculosis. The clothing was insufficient to withstand the winters, and the poorly insulated barracks did not provide shelter against the cold. Overcrowding prevented adequate rest, increasing vulnerability to diseases and accidents. The female prisoners suffered particularly. Sexual abuse by guards and common criminals was frequent and rarely punished. Pregnancies under these conditions often ended in unhealthy births and high infant mortality. Punishments were applied even for minor infractions. The reduction of rations, confinement in unheated cells, and public beatings were common methods to maintain discipline. Escape attempts were punished by immediate execution, and the bodies of fallen escapees were displayed as a warning to deter others. The brutality of the system was designed to reinforce the idea that obedience was the only possible path to survival. Later literature documented these experiences. Alexander Solzhenitsyn gathered testimonies in his work The Gulag Archipelago, while Vasily Shalamov described in Kolyma Tales life in extreme conditions, where survival often depended on sacrificing ethical principles. Both showed how the system destroyed both physical integrity and social and moral bonds. The administration of the Gulag developed practices to hide the magnitude of mortality. It was common to release prisoners in terminal condition so that they would die outside of the official records. With this, the statistics appeared more efficient than they actually were. The system also functioned as an engine of colonization. Entire cities, railway networks and roads were built by prisoners in areas where free labor would hardly have settled. Magadan, Vorkuta, and other settlements owe their existence to forced labor. During the Second World War, the camps adapted their production. Many internal factories manufactured uniforms, munitions, and other military materials. Some prisoners were released and sent directly to the front in a context where every soldier was needed. Even members of the clergy, persecuted in previous years, were temporarily rehabilitated to mobilize social support. However, the majority of the convicted remained in the system, serving full sentences in unchanged conditions. The sentence reductions were exceptional. Parole was practically non-existent, and even after being released, former prisoners faced severe restrictions. Many were forbidden to return to their places of origin and were forced to settle in peripheral regions under surveillance. The social stigma permanently accompanied them. They were presented as dangerous individuals, which made it difficult to find employment, access education, or integrate into community life. This stigma also affected their families, reproducing a hereditary condition of suspicion and marginalization. The files reveal that between 1930 and 1953, between 18 and 20 million people passed through the system. The recorded deaths are estimated to be between 1.5 million and 3 million, due to executions, diseases, accidents, internal violence, and suicides. Despite the enormous number of workers, the productivity of the system was low compared to free labor. The physical weakening of the prisoners prevented them from maintaining sustained work rhythms, and many projects turned out to be inefficient or failed. Everyday life within the camps generated informal survival mechanisms. A parallel economy developed based on bartering. Small objects, fragments of clothing, or additional rations circulated as alternative currency. These exchanges provided minimal advantages, such as one extra piece of bread or a less exhausting task. Correspondence with the outside was rigorously censored. Letters had to avoid references to real conditions, mortality, or punishments. Families received standardized messages, which hid the reality of the system behind a facade of normality. The Gulag was not just a repressive instrument, it was also a device of social engineering. Its impact transcended the prisoners and reached Soviet society as a whole. The threat of ending up in a labor camp served as a permanent reminder of the limits imposed by the state. The magnitude of the system made the fear of the Gulag a daily factor of social discipline, present beyond the walls and barbed wire that comprised it. On the 23rd of August, 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany was signed in Moscow. The public text contained clauses of mutual neutrality, but the attached secret protocols established a territorial division of Eastern Europe. Poland would be divided between the two countries along the Naru, Vistula, and San rivers, while Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia passed into the Soviet sphere. The agreement reflected a temporary convergence of interests, more pragmatic than ideological. On the 1st of September, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On the 17th of September, the Red Army entered from the east, fulfilling the agreed terms. The Soviet occupation of the eastern regions involved the immediate deportation of hundreds of thousands of people. Officials, officers, and their families were transported in cattle trains to Siberia and Central Asia, in conditions that caused a great number of deaths during the journey. The objective was to dismantle any possible organized resistance in the incorporated territories. In the spring of 1940, the NKVD executed more than 20,000 officers, police officers, intellectuals, and members of the Polish elite. The operation, centrally planned, took place in various locations, among which Katyn became the most well-known. The prisoners were transferred from internment camps and executed with shots to the back of the head. The bodies were buried in mass graves hidden with soil and vegetation. For decades, responsibility was attributed to the Germans through falsified documents and prepared testimonies. It was not until 1990 that the Soviet state officially acknowledged the NKVD's authorship. In the Baltic states, following the Soviet occupation of 1940, similar policies were applied. Thousands of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians were arrested and deported. In June of 1941, shortly before the German invasion, a major operation took place which sent tens of thousands of people to Siberia and Kazakhstan. The pattern was the same: transport in cattle trains for weeks without adequate food or minimal hygiene conditions. The winter war against Finland between 1939 and 1940 showed the structural weaknesses of the Red Army. The military purges of the previous years had eliminated a large part of the experienced officers. The lack of preparation of the leadership resulted in very high casualties. Despite numerical superiority, the Soviets did not achieve a quick victory and paid a very high price against an adversary smaller in size, but with effective defense strategies. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. Despite multiple intelligence reports warning of the attack, Stalin dismissed the signals and prohibited preparing immediate defenses. He considered it unlikely that Hitler would risk opening an eastern front while still fighting against Great Britain in the west. The decision allowed German forces to advance quickly in the first months. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured. The mortality of Soviet prisoners in German camps exceeded 80% as a result of deliberate starvation, lack of medical care, and lethal detention conditions. The regime responded with extreme disciplinary measures. On the 28th of July, 1942, Stalin signed Order 227, known by the slogan, "Not one step back." It stipulated that no unit could retreat without express authorization and created blocking detachments comprised of NKVD troops positioned behind the combat lines. Their task was to detain and execute those who attempted to flee. The archives document that more than 150,000 Soviet soldiers were shot by these units, accused of cowardice or desertion. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August of 1942 and February of 1943, was one of the most destructive engagements of the war. The city was devastated after months of house-to-house combat. Soviet casualties exceeded 1 million among the dead, wounded, and missing. The trapped civilian population suffered hunger and constant bombings. The Soviet victory was presented as an absolute triumph of Stalin's leadership and used in propaganda as a symbol of national resistance. The official narrative concealed that much of the resistance had been maintained through threats of execution against their own troops. The treatment of the Soviet prisoners of war liberated after the counter-offensive revealed another repressive aspect. Many were sent to NKVD filtration centers, where they were interrogated for weeks. They were considered suspects of collaboration with the enemy for the simple fact of having survived in captivity. Tens of thousands were sentenced to forced labor in the Gulag. The official doctrine held that a true patriot should resist to the death and never surrender. So returning alive was equivalent to a lack of loyalty. Logic even reached Stalin's own family. His eldest son, Yakov Djugashvili, was captured in July of 1941. The Germans tried to exchange him for high-ranking officers, including Marshal Friedrich Paulus, captured in Stalingrad. Stalin refused any negotiation. He argued that he would not exchange a soldier for a marshal, and that his son should share the fate of all Soviet prisoners. Yakov died in 1943 in Sachsenhausen. The Germans claimed he had committed suicide against an electrified fence, although the circumstances never became clear. His fate was presented propagandistically by both Germans and Soviets, each for different purposes. During the last years of the war, mass deportations of peoples accused of collective collaboration with the German occupier intensified. Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, Karachay, and Balkars were displaced to remote regions in operations carried out in a few days. NKVD troops surrounded villages, gathered the population in gathering centers, and gave them minutes to collect belongings. Those who could not move were abandoned or executed. Transfers took place in cattle trains for weeks, with very high mortality rates. Upon arriving at their destinations, mainly in Central Asia and Siberia, the deportees had to build new settlements under extreme conditions. Mortality during the first years of exile was very high. At the same time, a campaign against Soviet Jews began to develop. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, official propaganda linked Judaism with cosmopolitanism and loyalty to foreign interests. Jewish cultural organizations were closed, Yiddish theaters were shut down, and writers were arrested. Although this process would intensify in the post-war period, its foundations were laid in the last years of the conflict. The war provided Stalin the opportunity to strengthen his internal control through deportations, military repression, and tightening of social discipline. The victory over Germany allowed these measures to be presented as necessary for the defense of the fatherland, hiding the human cost behind the heroic narrative of the Great Patriotic War. On the 23rd of February of 1944, Operation Lentil began, directed by Lavrenti Beria at the head of the NKVD. Armed troops stormed into hundreds of villages in Chechnya and Ingushetia, ordering the population to gather in squares and open spaces. Men, women, elderly people, and children were loaded onto trucks and transported to railway stations. More than 400,000 Chechens and Ingush were deported to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in a matter of days. The transport was carried out in cattle wagons, without ventilation or heating, with families crowded together during journeys lasting up to 3 weeks. The lack of water, food, and medical care caused thousands of deaths in transit. Testimonials collected after the fall of the regime document mountain villages set on fire with their inhabitants inside to prevent evacuation in difficult-to-reach areas. In some remote sectors, NKVD teams opted for the direct elimination of entire communities instead of organizing complex transfers. None of these episodes were reflected in official reports. The pattern of collective responsibility was applied without distinction of age, sex, or social condition. In May of 1944, the same logic was applied to the Crimean Tatars. In just 3 days, about 200,000 were expelled under the accusation of collaboration with the German occupier. The measure indiscriminately affected both Red Army combatants and civilians alike. The deportees were sent mainly to Uzbekistan, where the lack of housing, drinking water, and medical services caused a mortality rate close to 40% during the first years. Children and the elderly were the most vulnerable. The deportation was accompanied by a campaign to erase Tatar identity, mosques closed, cemeteries desecrated, books burned, place names changed, and properties redistributed among Russian and Ukrainian settlers. The Volga Germans had been deported in 1941, in the first weeks of the war against Germany. More than 800,000 people were sent to Siberia and Central Asia, accused of constituting a fifth column. The operation set a precedent that would be replicated in the following years. In December of 1943, it was the turn of the Kalmyks, a Buddhist tradition people settled in the lower Volga region. Approximately 140,000 people were deported to Siberia. Their autonomous republic was dissolved and Buddhist temples destroyed. In 1943 and 1944, similar deportations were carried out against the Karachays and Balkars, whose mountainous territories were repopulated with foreign settlers, destroying local economies based on livestock raising. In 1949, the Pontic Greeks were deported under accusations of espionage in favor of Greece. Nearly 100,000 people were relocated to Central Asia. With this, i.e., traditional knowledge of navigation and maritime trade that had been passed down for centuries along the coasts of the Black Sea was lost. The forced dispersion involved the breaking up of historical communities settled since classical times. Deportation operations followed a common pattern. They were carried out in winter, taking advantage of the adverse weather to make resistance difficult. The NKVD surrounded populations during the night and gathered their inhabitants at dawn. Less than 1 hour was granted to gather minimal belongings. The seriously ill and elderly who could not move were abandoned or executed in their homes. Domestic animals and crops were left unattended, and the abandonment contributed to shortages in the destination regions. The journeys in closed wagons lasted weeks. A bucket served as a latrine for dozens of people, and access to water was limited to occasional stops. Guards prohibited disembarking, even when the train remained stopped for long intervals. Upon arriving in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Siberia, the deportees were placed in arid or frozen areas. They were assigned uncultivated lands that they had to transform into productive fields without tools or seeds. The supervision fell on local officials, who in many cases diverted official supplies, worsening the situation. Mortality in the initial years consistently exceeded 20% of the deportees, reaching even higher figures among the Crimean Tatars. Hunger, infectious diseases, exposure to cold, and the absence of medical care were the main causes of death. The cultural impact was equally profound. The breakup of communities and the prohibition of native languages interrupted the transmission of collective identities. Children grew up in environments where only Russian was spoken and lost knowledge of their mother tongues. Religious practices were banned or severely restricted, and territorial dispersion prevented the preservation of ancestral traditions. In parallel, a campaign against Soviet Jews was developed. Since 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, official propaganda intensified the association of Judaism with cosmopolitanism and foreign loyalties. Yiddish theaters were closed, publications in that language were banned, and cultural organizations were shut down. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which during the war had mobilized international support, was dissolved, and its leaders were arrested. Starting in 1949, a wave of arrests of Jewish intellectuals began. Writers, actors, poets, and academics were arrested on charges of bourgeois nationalism and ties with international Zionism. The interrogations, prolonged over months, resorted to physical and psychological torture already used in previous purges. On the 13th of August 1952, 13 prominent Jewish writers and artists were executed in Moscow. This episode, known as the Night of the Murdered Poets, eliminated a generation of cultural figures whose works were removed from libraries and whose names were erased from encyclopedias. The persecution culminated in the so-called Doctors' Plot, initiated in 1952. A group of doctors, mostly Jewish, was accused of poisoning Soviet leaders and preparing to assassinate other high-ranking officials. The arrests were carried out with extensive propaganda coverage, fueling widespread anti-Semitism. The accused were subjected to torture to force confessions, while the press linked the case to Zionist organizations and Western intelligence services. Later documents suggest that Stalin planned a mass deportation of Jews to Siberia or Central Asia, under the same scheme applied to other peoples. A propaganda campaign would have been prepared to present the measure as necessary to protect them from the supposed public indignation after the discovery of the conspiracy. Stalin's death in March of 1953 interrupted those plans. The detained doctors were released a few weeks later. The ethnic deportations and anti-Jewish campaigns reveal a pattern of repression based on collective responsibility. Entire communities were punished under general accusations, without individual trials or specific evidence. These measures altered the demographic composition of extensive regions of the Soviet Union, which were repopulated with settlers of nationalities considered more loyal. The consequence was the irreversible transformation of the country's ethnic map and the destruction of cultures with centuries of establishment. On February 28, 1953, Stalin held a dinner at his Kuntsevo residence with the four most influential men in his circle. Lavrenti Beria controlled the security apparatus. Georgy Malenkov held key positions in the party. Nikita Khrushchev led the organization in Moscow, and Nikolai Bulganin was Minister of Defense. The meeting lasted until the early hours of March 1st, in an atmosphere of tension masked by formality. Later testimonies agreed in describing a gathering marked by alcohol, the alternation of gestures of familiarity with episodes of irritation, and the relief of the guests at the conclusion of the evening. Throughout the following day, Stalin remained in his private quarters. The personal guards, accustomed to waiting for instructions, did not dare to interrupt him despite his prolonged absence. The fear of acting without explicit orders outweighed the concern for his health. After more than 12 hours had passed, late into the night, they finally checked the room and found him collapsed on the floor of his study, unconscious after suffering a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He lay paralyzed, with difficulty communicating, attempting to move a hand and follow with his gaze those around him. During critical hours, he did not receive specialized medical attention. The recent persecution against Soviet doctors had decimated the professional body and sowed distrust among the survivors. The available doctors hesitated to attend to the leader, fearing being accused of negligence. When a team finally arrived, the diagnosis confirmed extensive hemorrhaging affecting vital functions. The following days unfolded between episodes of irregular breathing, loss of consciousness, and frustrated gestures of communication. Death was officially recorded at 21 hours and 50 minutes on the 5th of March 1953. The public announcement was delayed for the leadership to organize the political transition and prepare control measures. The popular reaction was diverse. In cities where the cult of Stalin's figure had been more intense, crowds expressed spontaneous mourning. In territories punished by deportations, the news was received with silent relief, impossible to express openly. The funeral was organized as a demonstration of unity. The body was displayed in the House of the Unions and, on the 9th of March, transferred to the Mausoleum of Red Square. Thousands came to Moscow in long queues, but the lack of organization caused stampedes that left hundreds dead by crushing, events omitted in the official press. In the first years after his death, the cult continued. Monuments, portraits, and ceremonies presented him as the architect of socialism and the victor over fascism. However, the leadership discreetly began a process of revision. References to his infallibility were gradually reduced, and a different discourse emerged. In February of 1956, during the 20th Congress of the party, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a confidential report in which he denounced the crimes committed under Stalinism: purges, mass executions, repression against party cadres, and the establishment of a personality cult incompatible with the proclaimed principles. The speech was not published in the press, but it circulated among leaders and reached the outside world. For the first time, a Soviet leader officially acknowledged the magnitude of the repression. The figures of victims of Stalinism have been the subject of varied estimates. Most academic studies place the direct deaths between 15 and 20 million, resulting from executions, induced famines, deportations, and mortality in labor camps. Additional millions suffered imprisonment, internal exile, or political persecution. The demographic impact was visible in entire regions. Ukraine lost a large part of its rural population during the famine of the 1930s. Towns in the Caucasus and Central Asia saw their communities reduced after the deportations, and the intellectual class was decimated by the purges of the 1930s. The consequences were not limited to mortality figures. Generations grew up in an environment of distrust, self-censorship, and fear of denunciation. Betrayal became a tool for survival and destroyed family and community bonds. Silence about traumatic experiences was passed down from parents to children as a form of protection. At the same time, repression altered cultural structures. Entire communities lost languages, traditions, and collective memory. The partial opening of files following the dissolution of the Soviet Union revealed the bureaucratization of terror. Execution lists with signatures, batch arrest orders, correspondence between officials on repression quotas, documents that showed that these were not isolated excesses, but deliberate policies. The evidence confirmed that the system was supported by centralized decisions and administrative mechanisms that gave the appearance of legality to extermination practices. The subsequent historiographical debate addressed the nature of the regime. Some interpreted it as a personal dictatorship sustained by the absolute control of an individual over the state apparatus. Others analyzed it as a product of institutional structures that operated with their own logic, beyond the personality of the leader. The discussion included the role of ideology, used to justify violence as a necessary means for the construction of socialism and defense against internal and external enemies. This narrative legitimized the participation of officials at all levels, who carried out repressive policies presented as a revolutionary duty.